I've seen all different aspects of this field. I think we're...
All right, I am seeing the PowerPoint. Okay, now okay, full screen. All right, and okay. Michael, go ahead, finish introducing yourself.
I'm pretty well done. Go ahead.
All right, hi, I'm Karen Daniels. I've been with MoDOT for 20 years doing architectural history. Before I came to MoDOT, I worked for a regional planning office in Tennessee, working with small communities, doing all sorts of things, including architectural surveys. So I've kind of worked both sides of this issue. So I kind of know where you are. And I'm sorry, I didn't turn my camera on before I did this, and I'm not about to try to go back and do it. So you're just going to have to live with my voice. Most of you know what I look like anyway. So Michael and I are going to kind of have a conversation about the Section 106 process and how that relates to CLGs. And if you have questions, please feel free to pipe up. We would love this to be a dialogue basically between us and you, because we want this to be an educational experience for you, but we'd also love to learn about your experiences. So, page down. Page up. Okay, why is it not working today? Okay, it helps if you're actually in the slide. Technology is not my friend, I'm sorry. So we're going to kind of walk you through the Section 106 process, give you lots of examples from our projects of how local communities voicing their concerns have benefited our projects, and any federal project that benefits the public is a good federal project, and that benefit should include also historic properties. So that's what we consider a good thing. And we want to also show you some ideas of mitigation that's been heavily influenced by local voices, because that is really the true public benefit of Section 106, is when it meets your needs. So we want to give you some ideas of these are the things that have been possible in the past, and if you are asked to, or if you want to participate in the Section 106 process, it really is this is time to be creative. And the worst thing the agency can say is no. So just kind of, remember, come to the process with an open mind and just keep putting your ideas forward. So Jeffrey mentioned the National Historic Preservation Act. Part of the National Historic Preservation Act is Section 106, which requires that before a federal agency can move forward with a project, they have to consider the effects of their projects on historic properties. Historic properties being properties that are eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. From our perspective, eligible listed doesn't really matter that much. The only thing that gets special attention are National Historic Landmarks. Section 106 is generally considered to be a four-step process, and at any one of those steps, we can get to a resolution of that process. And as you will see, there's consultation throughout the process, and there's public involvement throughout the process. Michael, would you like to? I see you have notes.
Do I?
Yes.
No, I'm good here. The one thing that I do want to point out is when we're talking about consultation, there's always been this historical attitude in 106 in cultural resource management that it's actually the specialists, the agency, the professionals that make all these decisions on what's important. And we know best, and we sort of drive the process. And actually, that goes against the principles of the Preservation Act. It really is the antithesis of what we're supposed to be doing. What we're supposed to be looking at is the local communities, and in determining what is critical, what is important for the local communities. And that's why consultation is sort of the heart and soul of this process. And over time, this has become more and more realized. So I think if you had asked professionals 20 years ago, they'd be like, no, we don't need to talk with people, we know. These days, it's more of a more heavy emphasis on the consultation process of 106.
Yes, and consultation is supposed to be a very active participatory process. It's actually defined in our regulations as the process of seeking, discussing, and considering the views of other parties, and where possible, or feasible is actually what the regulations say, seeking agreement on matters arising out of the Section 106 process. So it's not just a, here we give you information and we allow you to comment. We're actually supposed to be actively seeking your comments and then listening to what you're saying. You know, a federal agency is actually supposed to listen to what you, the experts on your communities, have to say. And you are the experts on your communities. That's why we want to hear what you have to say about your community, and why it's important for you to have a role in the Section 106 process. Section 106 gives the locals with jurisdiction over a historic property the right to participate in consultation. That is spelled out in our regulations. Most agencies consider that to be the local elected officials, so it may not filter down to your historic preservation offices. So you may need to build up your relationships with your local government, because we all know on some projects, the local government may be pro-project and anti-preservation on some projects. We've all seen examples of that. You may have to approach the agency and say, hey, you know, we're the Historic Preservation Commission. We have this interest in historic properties. We would like to be a consulting party. And the guidance we have gotten from the Advisory Council says that just the asking that shows that interest, and you should be granted consulting party status. All you can do is ask. But as representatives of the local government, you should at least be participating with your government in the Section 106 consultation process. Now, you may be wondering how you find out about federally funded projects, because it's always better to find out about them early rather than late. For projects that are funded by Federal Highway Administration, it's actually pretty easy, because MoDOT produces what we call the Statewide Transportation Improvement Program, or the STIP. That's on our website. You can see every project we're planning on doing for the next 5 years. We're going to be amending it a lot because of that gas tax that passed, so we're getting more money than we're really kind of used to. But you can go onto our website and see what we're planning on doing. For projects that are going to be funded by federal highways but done by our local governments, you can go onto the Metropolitan Planning Organization websites and see their transportation improvement programs. And those will identify the projects that they're going to be doing. For other federal agencies, especially things like Housing and Urban Development, Small Business Administration, really become acquainted with your MPOs, your Metropolitan Planning Organizations, and your Regional Planning Commissions, because they are frequently involved in those processes of getting those grants, and they are usually aware of what is going on. And if you become aware of a federal or a project because it's already under construction and you wonder, hey, is there federal funding involved? Contact the SHPO. They should know what's going on with that project, and we hate it when it gets to that process or that stage of the project, but that may be the earliest you become acquainted. And also always pay attention to legal ads. Pay attention to the websites for projects or for agencies. Basically, pay attention to scuttlebutt. It's really kind of the best advice I can give you, because that is a great way to find out about projects. And most projects take at least a year to plan. Even for those HUD projects, those CDBG projects, just the planning stages for getting the grants and getting them spent takes time. So, but your local governments are usually involved in those. So your planning division, your locally elected officials, they usually know what's going on. So, page down. Click. Okay. I really am not the most technologically adept person. It's a good thing I'm a historian. Okay, so the first part of our Section 106 process that we actually involve our consulting parties in is establishing the area of potential effects. And the area of potential effects is the area or areas where an undertaking may affect historic properties. And the kinds of effects that we look at are construction impacts, including vibration impacts, auditory changes caused by a project, or visual changes caused by a project. These are kind of the common ones for a transportation project. They're actually the common ones established by the regulations too, but all of these can happen on a DOT project. Excuse me. One question we might have when we're talking with the certified local government is, are you really aware of a resource where there's a visual impact could really have really be a big issue? Because to be honest, we tend to draw a fairly narrow area of potential effects. And if there's a property where the view from the property to something is really significant and it's quite a ways away from where our project is, we may not necessarily notice it. So that's one of those things where if you're aware of the setting and this viewscape being really important, you telling us would be really helpful as early as possible, because that way we can consider and make sure that we minimize that impact as much as possible. Vibration impacts are things like pile driving for bridges, blasting, vibration impacts for removing a sidewalk and constructing a new sidewalk. Auditory impacts can include traffic noise. Visual changes can include a whole new road, noise walls, all sorts of visual impacts that are typical to DOT projects.
I should point out right here, Karen's been talking about the built environment, what's the impact of things that are visible. Generally, when you're talking about archaeological sites, people usually refer to the APEs just as the limits of construction. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb, but that's not always true for every type of project. So if you have archaeological resources, you have a historic property and there's archaeological site around the property. Look carefully at the type of project you have and carefully at the type of impact that project could have. So even though the excavation and direct impacts can be confined to the project limits, things like soil compression and water infiltration and things like that could actually expand beyond the limits of your construction. The impacts that actually occur underground that you don't take account of. So they're addressing these kind of these kind of project effects can be tricky depending on the type of property you're looking at and the type of project you're looking at.
Yeah, and this particular property in Jackson, the property owner raised the concern about dry laid stone foundation, and it was not something that was necessarily on my radar. And because he raised that concern, it changed how we consider vibration impacts around historic properties. And we have a JSP we use for removal of existing sidewalk anytime we're working around historic properties now. So that local voice really did make a big difference in how MoDOT works around historic properties. All right. All right. MoDOT does most of our survey work in-house because we actually have a full professional staff of qualified architectural historians, and archaeologists. We use built environment surveys that we developed in conjunction with our State Historic Preservation Office, and we've been using those methods for about 20 years now. But we will consult about survey methodology with our consulting parties because we want to make sure that our consulting parties understand what we are going to be doing. And if they have questions about something, or if they are aware that we need to take special care with certain types of resources, we want to know that when we're going out in the field the first time, rather than, oh, we have to go back again. So we will always consult about our survey methods for the built environment. Okay. Michael, I know you had something to say about this one.
I'm sorry.
I know, I saw.
Just gave me a note. I'm sorry. Now I got to look at my notes to see what I had to say about this one.
Professional standards.
Oh, professional standards. Just wanted to say that MoDOT is one of the few DOTs that actually has archaeological staff in-house, full-time professional staff in-house. So we have 9 archaeologists, 4 of them that can actually operate as principal investigators. We ensure that both our staff and consultants that we hire meet professional and ethical standards established by the NPS and SHPO and other professional organizations. And with that being said, some of the critical resources that we rely on are actually local organization and individuals. And there's 2 real reasons for this. One is local groups have a better grasp of the resources, including archaeological, that exist in the area. And 2, it's important for us to understand what resources are important to the local communities. Significant archaeology isn't simply about what archaeologists say is important. It's also about what the community wants to preserve. And this is the point where local groups can step in and lead the way, and showing what may or may not be locally important. And in that way, be able to sort of guide, direct the archaeological survey to some extent.
All right. We will share the results of our built environment survey with our certified local governments because we want your concurrence on our findings of eligibility and effects, but as part of our consultation process. But we also want to let you know that if your local government has a historic bridge that they're interested in, or a bridge that they're interested in, want to know more about, or if they have a project that is going to be impacting a bridge, please feel free to contact us because we have a good statewide perspective on bridges, and we would be happy to share information and perhaps give you more perspective on those bridges. Okay, so after we get done with our survey work, we write up reports and we evaluate the eligibility of resources for the National Register of Historic Places, because eligibility is what makes a property historic in under Section 106. This is where the knowledge of local governments or CLGs of what's in their communities and the opinions of local consulting parties can really help us, because what looks like a nondescript row of ranch houses could be a subdivision constructed by an African-American community before Shelley v. Kramer so that they could settle in the suburbs. And that might be exceptionally significant for that community. What looks like third round of redevelopment of a community square could actually be a landscape by a significant landscape developer and could actually have gained significance in its own right and need to be preserved. And this all came out through consultation and the involvement of local governments. So gaining that local perspective and that local knowledge is extremely important to us, and that knowledge helps preserve resources.
Well, for the archaeological evaluation of sites, the approach that has been taken over the years since basically the 1960s is that sites require research potential, and that can only be determined by archaeologists. So the natural outcome of this reason is that local comment isn't that important when evaluating archaeological sites. As I've indicated earlier, this sort of approach was come under attack in recent years because it really contradicts the spirit of the Preservation Act, which flatly states that we do this in the, quote, public interest. So the approach that many archaeologists take these days, including us at MoDOT, is that it's a combination of research or archaeological opinion and public interest. And oftentimes these two things do overlap, and sometimes it's the local community places more importance on resources than the archaeologist, more importance on a resource that the archaeologist may choose to pass over. And so for this reason, it is important for local groups to have an interest in preserving archaeological sites, to be actively involved in consultation, and to be able to have a say in National Register evaluations.
Okay. Page down. All right. After we know that we have properties that are eligible for the National Register, we have to assess the effect of our projects on those historic properties. And we have to apply what's called the criteria of adverse effect, which say that an adverse effect happens when an undertaking may alter, directly or indirectly, any of the characteristics of a historic property that qualify it for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, or association. So we're really looking for the character-defining features of the historic property and how much does the project diminish the integrity of those character-defining features. Some examples of adverse effects from the regulations include demolition of the resource in all or in part, alteration of a property not consistent with the Secretary of the Interior standards, relocation of a historic property, a change in the property's use or features that contribute to its significance, the introduction of visual, atmospheric, or audible elements that diminish the property, neglect, or the transfer, sale, or lease out of federal control without adequate measures to ensure preservation. Because of the ambiguity of most National Register listings, we might be reaching out to a certified local government about the significance of things like sidewalks. Even concrete sidewalks could have been built in the 1920s, and brick sidewalks were always going to raise red flags. So we may be saying, you know, hey, are these character-defining features of a larger historic property? Are these historically significant as part of a system in and of themselves? What's your opinion on these? Do you have regulations that actually cover these things? Because most National Register nominations are completely silent on sidewalk systems and the sidewalks themselves, and many of them, the property ownership on sidewalks, it's partly on private property, partly on public right-of-way, because all of this stuff was kind of, oh yeah, it doesn't really matter, we'll just put them in wherever. So it's one of those, it really is one of those areas where we tend to have a lot of conversation with CLG about, is this important? Can we change these things? Can we bring them up to ADA standards? Can we bring them up to, it's leaning at 45 degrees and nobody would want to walk on that too. Oh yeah, can we make it a functioning sidewalk again without having an adverse effect on a historic district where these sidewalks were not even mentioned in the historic district nomination form? Most places are not as clear-cut as Pasadena Hills, which is pictured here on the aerial, which actually indicated that its street system and its sidewalks were contributing elements of the larger landscape and planned community. And they actually have, in their design guidelines, approved coloring for concrete in their community, which is why you see our sidewalks are change colors right there at the entrance to Pasadena Hills. It made it really easy to say, okay, we're not going to have an adverse effect. We'll use their approved coloring. And everywhere else, we'll go back to our standard plain old concrete. But we did avoid an adverse effect because we used the approved coloring in Pasadena Hills. They recognized that materials needed to change over time. As long as we stuck with what they approved, it was fine. Anything on effects assessment, Michael? I tend to get caught up in sidewalk jobs. Sorry, guys. Okay, we're going to go on to if we look at the criteria of adverse effect and we say, yeah, it's going to have an adverse effect. The first thing we are supposed to do under Section 106, but truly enforced on a DOT because of Section 4F, is try to minimize that adverse effect. And this minimization can be through redesign or through special provisions, or just looking for ways to make sure that that adverse effect doesn't happen on that property. And the example on the left is the village of Arrow Rock. They needed to rebuild the highway through town, but they were very concerned about the stone gutters that line the highway because they were built in the 1850s and they knew that they were a contributing element of the larger historic village. So the way that we avoided having an adverse effect on those was the existing street near the gutters was removed by hand, new asphalt was put in by hand. They were covered when the oil overlay was put down. All of that was done very carefully and with care, and we avoided having an adverse effect. With the rehabilitation of the Jefferson Street footbridge on the right, they wanted to rehabilitate this bridge back into being a pedestrian bridge, but they needed to make it ADA accessible, so they wanted to include banks of elevators on each end. Now, that introduction of that new elevator would be an adverse effect. So they wanted to design that elevator in such a way to minimize that adverse effect. And we went through quite a bit of consultation with SHPO and local consulting parties to minimize that. And that project is actually currently out for bid right now. So there are times where we are able to minimize the adverse effect. We usually do still have some kind of an effect. We might completely avoid the adverse effect like we did in Arrow Rock. We might still have an adverse effect like we did on Jefferson Avenue footbridge, but minimizing that adverse effect is better than completely removing the property.
I'm going to jump in here real quick to discuss archaeology. This is going to sort of bridge the previous slide, this slide, and the next slide to a certain extent. When we're talking about archaeology, yes, a project could have an impact. A project could come in and destroy an archaeological site, in which case, we're going through this 106 process. But understand that oftentimes the mitigation for that, which will be our next topic, is going to be excavation, which in itself is destruction. So we'd be solving the problem of destroying an archaeological site with destroying an archaeological site. So for archaeology, it is very important, very critical, very high priority, this idea of minimization. Being able to minimize, being able to save, to preserve, or to avoid as much of an archaeological site as you can, because whatever you can't avoid and you use for excavation is gone forever. So oftentimes, even if we cannot totally avoid a site, it does pay to minimize those adverse effects and be able to save, keep at least portions of an archaeological site intact.
Yes. All right. And as Michael alluded, if we can't minimize the adverse effect, we have to mitigate it. And mitigation measures are put into a legally binding memorandum of agreement. We always consult with consulting parties about what mitigation measures are acceptable. That's with the SHPO, with Federal Highways, with us, or the local participating agency if it's an off-system project, with tribes if it's archaeological, to develop appropriate mitigation measures for adverse effects. Like I said, this is kind of where, preferably complete avoidance for archaeology, but if we can't avoid, actually preferably complete avoidance for everything, but if we can't avoid, this is the opportunity to really get creative about how can this project forward some of your preservation goals or some of your community's goals related to that resource, that neighborhood. And so we've actually got a few examples here of some really great mitigation efforts. And the first here is the Lafayette interchange here in Jefferson City. When Highway 50 was built, it went through part of a historic African American community. When MoDOT decided to put a new interchange in at Lafayette Street, it basically obliterated what was left of that community. And this is a community that had been impacted by urban renewal, then by the highway, and now by a new interchange. Now, mitigation measures should always be commensurate with the significance of the resource and the magnitude of the effect. But that magnitude of the effect also needs to consider how many times have you impacted that resource. So if we take a little bit of that archaeological site now and we take a little bit more in 10 years and a little bit more in 20 years, at some point in time we don't have that resource anymore. We always want to make sure that our mitigation considers our cumulative effects on that historic property. So because, you know, when we built Highway 50 in the 1950s, Section 106 didn't exist. So they were able to go through without doing anything. So we really wanted to make sure when we went through, again, that we tried to capture good mitigation measures that brought back to the community things that the community wanted. And the community wanted to make sure that their story was told. They wanted acknowledgement of what had happened to their community. So our Section 106 agreement basically said that we would document what was still left before our project came through. It included archaeological excavations of where our project was going through because there were some significant individuals associated with our project area. But our mitigation also included doing oral interviews, doing video interviews, doing a video that the community, for the community, doing a reader-friendly publication, doing a wayside exhibit, doing all sorts of things that benefit the community and tell the community's story. And this has just kind of grown because we actually have the contract out for the mitigation measures now. And they're doing video interviews of several people who used to live in this neighborhood, and they're doing an interview now of a gentleman who lived in the neighborhood who was working for the Housing Commission when they were doing the urban renewal project. So he was from the neighborhood, was buying the properties for the urban renewal project, and he wants to make sure he was trying to do the best he could for his neighborhood at the time. So that's part of the story that would never have gotten captured if it was not for our project. So it's one way of making sure that we're giving something back with our project. Michael, you're muted. Do you have something you wanted to say, Michael? Okay. I'll take that as a no. All right. For when we replaced the Champ Clark Bridge in Louisiana, there were a host of mitigation measures that were being considered at the time. But one of the mitigation ideas that was proposed was a historical marker in the park overlooking the river. And somebody brought up the idea of, can you make that marker out of pieces of the bridge? And to me, this is an example of a mitigation measure that grows beyond what you can, I could never have written this mitigation. I could never have written this project. I would never have dreamt of this project. So we put in our MOA, we'll do a historic marker on the Champ Clark Bridge, and we'll try to incorporate pieces of the bridge. The project manager for the design build project said, you know, hey, we're incorporating STEM elements into our project. Can we take this historic marker that you have and use that as a STEM challenge for our area high schools? Well, sounds interesting, and as long as we're not obligated to something we don't like, sounds like a plan. So we had 7 high schools in 6 communities participating in a STEM challenge to design a historical marker on the Champ Clark Bridge. They got to learn about contracting, teamwork, budgeting, historical research, because they had to include information on the Champ Clark Bridge on this. They had to do presentations to the judges and to the public. And in the end, we actually ended up with a historical marker that was a combination of two separate proposals, because we liked the marker that one group did, but I liked the text that another group did. So just as often happens in real life, you take 2 different ideas and put them together. I never could have written this mitigation measure because I never would have dreamt it. But on a cold January day in 2020, and it was rainy and it was drizzly, we had about 75 people come to a marker dedication, which for a Wednesday morning on a cold, drizzly day was really, really good. But we had some of the students who had been seniors when they were doing this back in 2018-2019 school year, came to the marker dedication because this was so important to, this project had become so important to them. And this was, this was an idea that was basically just kind of randomly and casually thrown out there as, oh, just make it out of the bridge. So never underestimate where an idea can go. So think creatively. Okay. When we were making improvements to Highway 67, we were going to have an adverse effect on the site of Old Greenville, which is listed on the National Register and which was affected when Lake Guapapello was constructed. In consultation with the SHPO and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, it was decided that additional archaeological work would not likely yield additional information on the site. However, the Corps of Engineers and former residents had a long list of unfunded desire for additional interpretation for the community. So our mitigation was basically to do this unfunded interpretation that had been, the Corps had wanted to do for years. Former residents had noted the desire for street signs because the community had been displaced 50 years ago, I think it was, by that point in time. So they were having a hard time navigating the community anymore because the streets were gone, it was overgrown. So we put up street signs to help them orient themselves and kind of developed a trail system. Drafts of the various interpretive panels were put up. Community members were able to comment on them. But interpretive panels on the history of the community development, important people and buildings were all developed, and people were given the opportunity to comment on them. A panel on the Trail of Tears was also done. And that one was finalized with input from the from the Cherokee Nation and the National Park Service. This project included absolutely no elements of what we consider traditional mitigation, but every element fulfilled a need identified by community members and the Corps of Engineers, and it resulted in a mitigation project with a great deal of public impact. So,
Karen.
Yes.
Can you go back a couple of slides? I think I got my mic working again.
Back to foot?
Back to Lafayette. Thank you.
Okay.
Wanted to point out 2 things about this project. One is it started off as a small mitigation effort on our part, and it grew and encompassed much more. And in the end, it became part cultural resource, historic preservation, mitigation project, and part environmental justice project. So it far outgrew the initial how we initially started the project. And the second thing that I want to point out is this is a good example, this project is a good example of us using the 106 process, federal funding, the DOT, to basically seed a local project. So, we started this oral history project for our mitigation, but we're able to partner with local historic preservation groups to expand on that. So, neither one of us had, both of us were able to participate and make a larger project out of what was initially a very modest mitigation. So this is a good example of being able to maximize the end result from mitigation funds.
Yes, and much of the mitigation for this project was not actually historic properties. It was actually the EJ mitigation. So certified local governments can help shape projects by helping us shape the survey, identification, evaluation, avoidance, and mitigation. Anything that agencies do to help comply with Section 106. Working together, we can use Section 106 and those other laws to help meet goals identified by our local partners and have great Section 106 projects. So